I did want to mention that I will be showing clips from My Hero Academia, specifically from the first season, although I believe I won't be hitting any serious spoilers, but just in case, I thought I would mention it if anyone is still interested in watching the show and they haven't. Although it has been out so long, I'd honestly be surprised. This is kind of an old topic to use. Chapter 1. So before I dive headfirst into a bunch of self-fabricated, heady concepts, I do want to give a bit of a background on my interaction with storytelling and media. For it can easily be said amongst my friends that I can be pretty picky about the content I consume. I do watch a lot of stuff from different genres, countries, and mediums, as I'm genuinely interested in storytelling and all its forms. Although I have accrued a bit of a reputation as a stickler. I may be willing to watch a lot, but I'm not easily impressed, and can be somewhat harsh and critical in my analysis of an art piece. This is especially so with American media. I only point out American media, not because I think it's better or worse, but simply because it's the content I am most familiar with. And even outside of American content, such as anime, I am often skeptical or critical of very popular pieces, especially those of the shonen genre, such as Naruto, One Piece, or My Hero Academia. I want to be clear that I don't think any of these pieces of content are inherently bad, but they do challenge ideas that I have about what I consider good versus bad storytelling. But that doesn't mean they aren't good entertainment, or supply substantial value, or that anyone who's worked on them aren't extremely talented or passionate, because in most cases, the listed examples are usually true. So please understand, I'm not here to convince people that the product itself is a bad product and shouldn't be enjoyed. They should. And despite any criticisms, I do enjoy a lot of media, regardless of if they are actually, quote-unquote, good or bad. But I think I should explore this idea at least a little bit before we truly begin. The concept of a good or a bad story. It's ultimately subjective, right? In many regards, yes. But I think there are certain qualifiers that can be used to create a slightly more objective meter. But at the end of the day, whether a piece of art meets these qualifiers or not, it's still possible for someone to experience a deep and profound reaction to something. So no matter how I end up qualifying these things, don't doubt that feeling in your gut, or those instinctual sensations that say, this fucking rocks, and I don't care what you say. So take everything with a grain of salt. In truth, this is probably more targeted towards content creators than consumers. For anyone that wants to make that perfect story, or create something that they feel is evocative or deep, think of this essay as a guideline towards that goal, and a way to structure your thoughts or approach to anything you might make in the future. Well, that was a bit long, but without further ado, let's actually talk about the story triangle. Chapter 2. So I've ranted a good long while, and I'm yet to talk about the subject at hand, but let's get to the meat of it. So what exactly is this story triangle? Well, it's a simple tool that I use when I'm analyzing a piece of work that can really apply to anything. TV, anime, video games, board games. Although it should be said that in this way, it only specifically analyzes a story of these given mediums. If for some reason a show or a video game does not inherently have a story, then pretty much none of this applies. So keep that in mind. It's simply for the art of storytelling. Alright, so you're watching a show or playing a game, and you're trying to invest yourself into the story of it. Ultimately, I think this can be broken down into 3 ideas. The first is concept, which is the underlying idea behind a story, such as the premise or the pitch, how it can be summarized, or the initial ideas that were the cause of inspiration. To take subject of the title in the video, My Hero Academia, the concept is pretty simple. It's a world where superheroes exist and acquire superpowers called quirks. Most of these powers are acquired at birth, but take some time to develop, although our protagonist was born quirkless, and through a series of circumstances inherited a quirk, something unknown to the world at this time. All in all, it's pretty simple. I have a lot to say about concepts, but for now let's just say in most industries, concepts are important. It's what gets your story on the ground floor. Next, we have Intentionality. This is how the story handles itself. This is not necessarily a critique on the content creator's intent, but how the story conducts itself and treats its own story beats. I'm gonna emphasize, this is not the creator's intent, for more often than not we aren't backstage during the creation of these pieces and shouldn't postulate on people we don't know or understand. So in this context, this is simply how the finished product conducts itself. Regardless of the artist's intent, a story might come off as too serious, or not serious enough, or just middling, or uninterested in its own concepts. This happens a lot in movies due to the editing process, where despite the writer's or director's intent, something completely different comes out. A popular example right now is Justice League, especially after the release of something like the Snyder Cut. It's obvious that in Zack Snyder's opinion, the intentionality of the original cut was wrong, and displayed the wrong part of his vision in regard to the original Justice League. I know. I said not to read into the intent of the creators, but I think it's fair to say that the original version was poorly received, and I think it's mainly because it didn't know what it was trying to do. Was it trying to be epic? Was it trying to be funny? Was it trying to be like Marvel or its own thing? Or maybe it's trying to be all those things at once. The fact that there aren't clear-cut answers to this demonstrates the product's poor intentionality. And so finally, we have utilization. This is the execution of each part of the story. What story elements are used and reused, or the moment-to-moment details embedded into the product to convey the themes and messages at large. Just so you know, the story doesn't always have to have strong themes or messages to have good utilization. In some senses, it can be seen as the story's ability to complete the goals of the story. For example, if you have a story that's all about killing a bunch of characters with no deeper poetic meaning or purpose, and the product does a good job of achieving that, it can still have good utilization. Although this is closely tied to intentionality, so there may be times where you may utilize the goal of the piece well, but it doesn't come off as if it did, because its intent is perceived incorrectly. Now, with all three of these ideas laid out, I usually use this chart as a metric for an overall quality of a story. In this regard, I will be using a simple A to F metric, like a grade, but keep in mind it can also be used to outline a preference. I would personally say that some of these ideas can suffer while making a good story still. For me personally, it would look something like this, but for others, it might look like this. Regardless, I think we ultimately all want to see something like this. That's hard to do, so let's just focus on what we can do and how we can interpret stories as they are and try to compare them. We can also use this as a platform to analyze trends in our entertainment industry and ultimately what might lead to better storytelling without the loss of things we hold dear, such as good animation in a show or gameplay in a video game. Chapter 3. Alright, it's time to really sink our teeth into it. We've gone over a metric to measure stories within different mediums. But what really is the point? Will this actually help us make better stories, or be more aware of the content we consume? Even if it does, will we actually be better off from where we started? In truth, I have no idea, but I can hope so. So let's just slap it down. After looking at a lot of content across a lot of mediums, having endless debates and conversations and thinking tenfold on it, I started to notice a trend. When it's all said and done, and yes, this is gonna be a fat generalization, when we talk about shows, animes, games, and the like, made by large companies or publishers, they have a very similar MO. And it looks something like this. Across a broad listing of art pieces and stories, to be successful in the industry, you typically have to have a strong concept. And even when talking to audience and viewers about different kinds of stories, there is a heavy emphasis on concept. For example, if I'm trying to convince my friend to watch a show, it would be easier to convince him with a concept like, so all of humanity is dead, and being infused with the blood of a demon, the last human vows to kill as many monsters and devils that inhabit the earth before he dies. Then a concept like, 2 high schoolers join a ping pong team. Then wacky hijinks ensue. It's pretty clear what is the stronger concept, but we can all admit for the most part, even if you have the coolest concept known to man, that if they don't execute it right or portray itself properly, then it doesn't matter. a bad story is a bad story. I believe this phenomenon happens though because a wealthy publisher or company probably chooses based off a concept and hopes that the development team are able to execute on the rest of the triangle. Despite this though, I have often felt like too many stories have survived on concepts alone, and ultimately with poor intentionality and poor utilization. So do keep in mind that this isn't an all-out assault on a piece of art, but specifically just a story, and what part of that story we get to see and experience. I believe in a perfect world where we have perfect stories and perfect mediums to convey them, that it would be broken down something like this. Number 1, a concept is laid down. Any ideas that circulate that concept are anticipated or at least discussed. As an example, in My Hero Academia, the concept is a world of genetically born superheroes integrating through society and attaining social status through commercialization and public success. I know it seems a bit heady for the direction the show goes for, but it's true. These concepts exist within the initial idea, and I mean some of it is literally said in the first episode. Number 2, you utilize these ideas and create scenes, moments, or interactions that extenuate them. If you bring an idea into a story, then you better explain it. Once again, in My Hero Academia, they show shots of figurines and toys of popular superheroes, and even have some scenes where the middle-class heroes compete to take down a bad guy to improve their status and reputation. Sometimes though, concepts just kinda get thrown around in the scene and never come back up again. I would say for something that was let out in the first episode, the commercialization of the superhero industry is a massively minor part of at least the first season. Number 3. You create these scenes and moments in a way that is clear to the audience what the point or the direction of the narrative is going. For an example, our main character is constantly bullied for being quirkless, which sets a precedence of importance on the status of superheroes along with an obstacle for him to overcome. The show wastes no time in making quirks seem important, which sets an expectation of its involvement in the story. We expect to see more quirks, and we expect more story to evolve around the idea of quirks. Once again, in a perfect world, no idea would get tossed out on the wayside. We'd theoretically construct scenes and dialogue in the amount of time given to at least ameliorate the ideas so they don't seem like plot holes or forgotten concepts. But that's difficult, and probably the hardest thing about telling a story and making it move from something written on paper into an animation, a game, or even a board game, and has untold complications. I think the truth is, as much as I hate to say it, it is the reason why most stories lean so hard on concepts. With a strong concept, many of the viewers' audience can fill in the gaps. To this day, I don't feel like My Hero Academia adequately explains the complexities that come along with a superhero industry, or the dynamic moral dilemmas of having institutionalized violence being taught to kids with superpowers, at least within season 1. These concepts were introduced, and they even talked about it a little bit, which proves that the creators weren't ignorant to it, but they mostly leave it to the viewers to assume it works, to assume that there is probably an explanation, and frankly, I'm not satisfied. Chapter 4. So, I can't delay this any longer. I'm gonna have to actually start talking about the show. And based on the last chapter, I think you've started to get an idea of how I feel. If you are displeased thus far, then please, give me a moment longer. You might be surprised. But obviously, I have some qualms with the overall story of My Hero Academia. I think they throw a lot of ideas around that kinda just fall on the wayside, and in terms of the triangle, really makes the utilization score suffer. Plus the idea of superheroes integrating into society have existed in superhero comic books forever, so the concept isn't all that sparkling either. It mostly survives on the already appreciated superhero genre, and added very little elements to distinguish it other than the story's country of origin. So if I were to give this show a grade, it would probably be something like this. Yeah, not a great score, but there is an A out there, so for some that's not bad. but I really want to hone in on that, the A for intent, because I spent years refusing to watch the show, and honestly was extremely critical of it from the get-go. After watching so many goddamn shows, you start to get a feeling for them. I was making pretty broad assertions without ever even watching it, mostly because these things were apparent even in trailers or discussions about the show. But there was one thing I was horribly wrong about, and that was its intentionality. Something that pleasantly surprised me from the very first episode is that not only was the show's intent crystal clear, but they even played with it a bit. So much they almost became a parody of the genre they were trying to emulate. So much that they might as well have had characters face the screen and wink in self-recognition. For me personally, this changed everything. They obviously weren't hurting me with the concept, and from everything I'd seen, they would bring up as many interesting ideas as they would abandon. But the show was extremely self-aware. They had goals in many regards, and I think they achieved them. I don't think the goals were evolved around the story, but many other aspects of the show. But they owned it. They didn't back away, and they didn't try to subvert or surprise. When a trope got in their way, they didn't try to avoid it. They embraced it. I love this. Personally, the show wasn't for me, but I did start to recognize their clear deliberation. They had goals and they achieved them, and in many regards I respect this much more than a story that can't get their intent right. And once again, I'm not talking about the creator's intent, I'm talking about the story itself. Every story beat, every conversation, every scene was built around letting us know what the show wanted to be seen as, and it succeeded in those regards. The show knew what it was, and it wasn't confused on what it was trying to be. So with that, I actually really do admire the show. I feel like stories told in this manner have a very short shelf life and can't sustain itself long term. But that doesn't mean they didn't succeed at what they set out to do. A show about young kids overcoming obstacles through quirky superpowers. And they didn't try to convince me that the show was gonna dive into any of these heady concepts that they brought about early on. They might as well have had big text that said they were gonna abandon those complexities, which in my case, I'm grateful for, because I get hung up on those things. I want answers to them, but the anime showed its intent clearly, and said they weren't gonna be answered, which allowed me to kinda sit back and just enjoy whatever the hell I was watching. I think this is the true nature of intentionality. Once again, not the creator's intent, but what the story kind of says about itself. It's not its ideas or how well they integrate them, but the dialogue between us, the viewers, and the experience. Chapter 5. So, all in all, My Hero Academia is a good show. I haven't watched all of it, and I heard there are some very good points later on, and despite some of my criticisms, I do recommend watching it. I also hope that if you're trying to make your own story, that this might help you, either structure or how to approach it and be mindful of what you're doing. In my opinion, I'd not stress too much about concept and ideas conveyed in a story, because it's my honest belief that if a story shows its intent and utilizes its ideas properly, then the concepts can kind of suck ass. For example, remember earlier in the video how I used the example of a weak concept, such as 2 high schoolers join a ping pong team? Well, that's actually a concept I got from a real show called Ping Pong the Animation. I mean, I'm talking F-tier concept. It's boring as hell, but the show itself is amazing. It shows its intent clearly, it utilizes its ideas extremely well. It's slow but very intriguing and has an extremely unique animation style. I don't know if it is, but it looks hand-drawn. And I only bring this up to show that within a story triangle, concepts are actually the least important of the 3. So don't stress out if your idea is cliche, tropey, or unoriginal. It's all about how you execute it, and how it speaks its intent that matters. For if you can make a show about 2 ping pong players interesting, you can make anything interesting. At the same time, that doesn't mean not to go for big brainy concepts, because bigger concepts give you more to work with in terms of ideas. It just becomes harder to utilize them. But if you want a large, heady concept, then go for it. Like I said, just don't stress about it too much. Just make sure everyone knows what the story is saying, and utilize any ideas you bring about into it. a video essay, and the next one I'm doing will probably also cover more on the story trying, but I don't want to get a reputation of only studying anime, so I'll try to kind of make these essays on different mediums like live action shows or video games. I hope this was helpful, or at the very least entertaining, and let me know what you think in the comments section. How would you grade My Hero Academia or other stories? If you liked the video, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe, and if there are any stories in particular that you would like me to cover, let me know. Until next time, see you later, dreamers.